Well, it is my pleasure to welcome everyone on the call, and I know that we will other people will be coming in as we get going, but to honor everyone's time, I'm going to go ahead and begin. Welcome to the PSU Futures Collaboratory, first of 4 Future of Work webinars that we have put together for the 2020-21 academic year. We are beyond excited about these sessions and very appreciative of you joining us today. Before I get going with the introductions of our speakers, I wanted to share just a little bit of history about the PSU Futures Collaboratory and invite you to get involved. Our collaboratory was established in 2019 by then acting President Stephen Percy to serve as a place where people from across our campus could join in an experimental and improvisational space to explore the topic of the future in big as well as practical ways and build the collective skill of foresight. During the last 2 years, we've been visited by an array of amazing and thoughtful futures thinkers and practitioners, learned a variety of foresight tools and frameworks, and applied these tools to real-world challenges we have at PSU in a variety of ways. What a body of knowledge to be exploring during these last couple of years with futures thinkers around the world during a time of such rapid change, disruption, calls for justice, and unprecedented transition. We have and will continue to make recommendations to our president and administration, and increasingly we are being invited into spaces all over campus to share what we've been learning and practicing to both democratize foresight tools and encourage more of a long-term view of the challenges we face, rather than being stuck in short-term cycles of reactivity and emergency. Our goal has been to build capacity, collective imagination, agility, and intelligence to the very real challenges that we face as an academic community. Our values center on expanding access and success to students throughout our region, with issues of justice and equity prioritized, and special attention to longstanding structural barriers to success for BIPOC and other minoritized student groups. Increasing our vibrant and impactful presence in our world as well through our collective contributions. Foresight practice is always a balance of simultaneously assessing threats to the future we want while co-creating visions and plans for our preferred futures. Our motto for the collaboratory has been "the future is plural," because so much is still possible. The future isn't set. We assume we will occupy an increasingly complex space as a public university, and we're actively envisioning what being ready for the future means to us collectively. Please visit our website. I'll put the link in as we get going to see more about what we've been doing this year. Our site is full of resources, including a special Future of Work page with numerous scans, trend reports, and more related to the future of work. There is also a survey on the front page linked to something called the Big 3 questions to invite you into our dialogue. I am a public interest foresight practitioner, which is to say I'm aligned with foresight efforts that boost equity, human rights, justice, and democracy. I'm Laura Nissen. I don't think I said that. I'm also a professor of social work, a presidential futures fellow, founder of the PSU Futures Collaboratory, and a research fellow at the Institute of the Future. I want to thank my partner and co-creator, also a founding member of the collaboratory, Dr. Sally Mudiamu, who's Director of International Partnerships, she can wave, at PSU, and certainly a cornerstone member. And I also just want to give a shout out to Mr. David Burrow and his team, who's helping manage our technical aspects of this event. To begin, we share the vision that the future of work is coming, whether we're ready for it or not. Many are suggesting that COVID-19 has not so much changed the trajectory of the future of work as much as it has accelerated. Some say as much as 10 years, and our speaker will tell us more about that. There's so much for us to learn together in this space, because the future of work is not just happening out there, it's also happening right here at PSU. The future of work is in many respects a story about equity, justice, human rights, human agency, and the future of well-being. Sometimes the future of work discourse is pitted against the future of higher education discourse, and this is a problem of long-standing tensions that really needs to be acknowledged. Our purpose today is showing how inextricably connected these two topics are, particularly at a university in which so many of our students are invested deeply in experiencing their own economic mobility as a result of their education. Our purpose as a university is to provide architecture for students to participate in the world and in their future careers in ways they choose, and that they learn to walk through, break down, or go around barriers that may appear. What must we as a university learn about these changing pathways to the future of work and meaningful, equitable career trajectories to be effective in serving our students in the coming years? How can these lessons make us better and stronger as a university without compromising our values and ideals as educators? I'm a strong believer that the university should not be driven by the dynamics of the future of work, but neither are we free to ignore these dynamics. Fortunately, we don't have to. So let's learn together. California has been at the center of many of the world's innovations in science, technology, and business. While the state boasts a strong and vibrant economy by most measures of growth, too many Californians have not fully participated in or enjoyed the benefits of the state's broader economic access and extraordinary wealth generated there. Though there are many anticipated technological changes and advancements, the effects of that change are not predetermined or inevitable. The California Future of Work Commission proposed a bold new social compact for work and workers based on that expansive vision of economic equity. Our speaker today and leader of the California Work Commission effort is Dr. Anmol Chaddha, who is research director of the Equitable Futures Lab at the Institute for the Future. This lab considers how economic and technical changes might create opportunities to address problems of social inequality. The Equitable Futures Lab aims to innovate and shape interventions, particularly on wealth inequality, job quality, and ongoing economic transformations. Dr. Chaddha is going to describe to us what was learned through this year-long exploration, the largest of its kind in the United States, across California, and give us an opportunity to reflect out loud with him for what these lessons might mean for us. Anmol has extensive policy and research background in political economy of inequality, low wage work and job quality, racial inequality, debt, and wealth. Prior to joining IFTF, he developed policy and research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, where he established an initiative to improve the quality of jobs in low-wage industries, led research on racial wealth inequality, and examined the rising debt burden of low-income families. He holds a PhD from Harvard University, where he was a fellow in multidisciplinary programs in inequality and social policy at the Kennedy School of Government, and a BA from the University of California at Berkeley. Following the speaker's remarks, we'll be joined by two PSU respondents, Dr. Robert Asaadi, instructor and scholar with CUPA, who teaches in political science and international studies and is an expert in post-revolutionary Iran, and Rhianna Mungin, who is a mechanical engineering student who studies microgravity capillary fluidics, one of my favorite topics, which is really about fluids in space. Rhianna is helping us figure out how to grow plants in space, basically. She has just accepted a new position as a strategic energy management coach for Energy 360. She'll be blending engineering and communication skills to coach companies to make systemic changes to save energy. And then we'll open it up to dialogue from the audience. Feel free to use the chat function today. However, if you have any specific questions, please put them in the Q&A, because that is where I'll be pulling audience questions later. Dr. Chaddha, we send you a big, warm Portland welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. I will now turn it over to you. Oh.
I'm muted, yep. It's bound to happen. Thank you so much for that introduction. Let me pull up the slides that I was hoping to use for this real quick. Let's see. There we go. That should be showing okay, right?
Looks good.
Perfect. So as Laura mentioned, I've been managing the Future Work Commission in California, which is actually ended up, it was planned for 1 year and actually ended up going for 2 years because of the COVID interruption, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. And we wanted to be sure that we adequately, it was slated to wrap up in spring 2020. And we were just on the precipice of releasing our recommendations and report at the beginning of April 2020. And then we're, obviously, like everyone else was, was sort of interrupted by the COVID pandemic. And we wanted to take that opportunity to actually reflect on how those changes could further shape the future of work, as Laura mentioned as well. And so we extended the period of the project and the work and the commission for essentially almost another year, about 8 months or so. And then just recently, last month, released this report calling for a new social compact for work and workers. So I'll talk a lot about the commission's work here today. And just, in sort of some context or some background framing, we all know there have been many conferences and convenings and panels and reports, even a few other state commissions on the future of work. Probably many of the participants today have been to some of these conferences or convenings before today. I've had to read through so many of the reports they've issued, and they cover a lot of the same ground. Some of the common topics are around questions around technological change, around automation, and the threat of job displacement through technological change and automation. They often sometimes paint a vision of dystopian visions of a future with no jobs. Sometimes it's actually a utopian vision of a future with no work for people to do, and so we could have more time for leisure and things like that. And one of the reports that I wanted to just look at briefly or reflect on briefly is describe the concern that technological change could, quote, eliminate all but a few jobs, with the major portion of work being performed by machines. And that, in this report, they were concerned with how that would exacerbate inequality. And they went on to insist that, quote, the burdens and the benefits of technological economic change should be distributed fairly. And that report, some of the key recommendations from that report were things like job training, a guaranteed minimum income, a federal jobs guarantee, and free college for everyone who wanted it or wanted to access college. And that, sounds like it could have been a platform for somebody running for president in the recent election, but it's actually from the 1965 report of the National Commission on Technology, Automation, and Economic Progress, which was now more than 55 years ago. And so in many ways, when we started this commission, I look back and we looked at some of these early reports and these early commissions that were looking at similar issues. And we found that, we've been here before. The technology today is different, but many of the underlying concerns are really similar, or especially around the distributional consequences of technological change and economic transformations. And even some of the proposals that sound bold and novel today were actually suggested more than 5 decades ago. And so at the outset of our commission, we were really concerned with how would our effort be different, right? We didn't want to recreate the wheel. What could we add beyond some of the ongoing work, especially in the last 5 years or so around in the conversation around the future of work. And I think, oh, that's not right. Oh, I don't know. Let me just, sorry, getting a preview here. So just as a way of sort of a preview of where we're headed with this, the California Future Work Commission eventually landed on a call for a new social compact for work and workers. And there were exactly 5 priority recommendations as part of this social compact that engages a range of stakeholders. So it's government, it's employers, it's tech companies, it's labor and worker groups, higher systems of higher education and others as well, to bring about some of these priority recommendations. And we'll revisit this in the second half of the talk, but the 5 key ones were ensuring that there are jobs for everyone who wants to work. The second was eliminating working poverty. The third is creating a 21st century worker benefits model and a social safety net. The fourth is this emphasis on job quality and raising the standard of jobs in the state and the share of jobs that meet some standard of job quality. And the fifth is looking to the future and what the commission is calling future-proofing California, with jobs and skills to prepare for technology and other shocks like climate and things like that. So just as a way of getting back into our underlying framework that we wanted to bring into the commission at the outset, there are a few key topics that we saw that were really dominating the future work conversation up to this point. I mentioned automation and technology. There's a lot of discussion on skills and job quality. And the third was this question around, or this phenomenon around the fishing of work that's related to the gig economy, and I'll go into each of these deeper now. And so we wanted to sort of move beyond what were some of these debates or discussions within each of those topics and really build towards a more expansive vision of economic equity for California. Laura mentioned this at the outset as well, that California, we know is an extraordinarily economically successful state. It's also ground zero for the economic and technological changes that are shaping the future of work. But so many of so much of the extraordinary wealth that's been generated in California through the tech industry and other industries has not benefited many workers in California, and that prosperity has not been shared. And so we wanted that to be the sort of overarching theme of this commission. How can we approach issues of economic equity, taking work and jobs as an entry point into that conversation or discussion, because we believe that California, and like much of the rest of the nation, was really facing a crisis in terms of economic inequality. So on the first bit around automation and technology, this comes from the MIT Tech Review, and they were, they did a review of all the studies that looked at predictions about the effects of automation. What they found was a lot of uncertainty. The estimates are all over the place. They found that there were about as many opinions about how many jobs are going to be displaced as there are experts that are making these judgments. And it's a key point that we, in our approach to thinking about technological change that Laura also mentioned was, which I think is really key, is this idea that the effects of technology and technological change are not predetermined, or they're not inevitable, right? So the effects of technological change play out within a context. They play out within a policy context, within a social context, within a historical context. And through policy, through public policy, we're able to actually shape that context through which technological change will have its broader social effects or social implications. And so we can shape we have opportunities to shape how technology plays out, who it affects, where do the gains, how do the gains get distributed from technological change and other economic transformations. So that was kind of one key fundamental approach to thinking about technological change. The second thing was that a lot of the discussions around technological changes has been dominated by this question of automation and job displacement. So we wanted to expand a little bit beyond that as well, that there's many things about technology, technological change that aren't actually about automation. There are many things about technological change that affect the future of work, that are shaping the future of work, that aren't about automation or job displacement necessarily. So technology, technological change can change work in many ways. So I listed some of these on the slide here. It could change the amount of work, the content of work, working conditions, obviously, how people are compensated for the work that they're doing, how firms and organizations are organized, the distribution of that work across the population and place, which I think is really important, especially in a state like California, where we see really profound regional inequality. And so that's the first part about how we wanted to think about the technological change and the questions around tech and automation. The second was this question around skills and job quality. And I think we could think of two general approaches to policy work on jobs and skills and training. And we could think about either focusing on upskilling workers themselves directly through job training and things like that, or we think about upgrading jobs as a sort of unit of analysis. And there's a lot of overlap in practice, of course, but I think it's worth analytically distinguishing between these two approaches. So again, the upskilling workers sort of approach it focuses very much on the labor supply in the labor market. So it focuses on workers and upskilling and training workers to, whether it's adapting for the jobs of the future or the jobs of the present. And there's an implication that with this approach that there may be a skills gap with the current workforce and how it's lined up with the jobs that exist in the economy, and using skilling and training as a way to sort of lift workers up to better paying jobs. So they may start in a low wage job, but by increasing their skills or training, we can move them up into higher paying jobs and then address the problem of low wage work through that model. And the second one is upgrading jobs themselves. So really raising the floor of low wage jobs so that those jobs still exist, but those jobs maybe pay better, maybe come with a different set of benefits, come with different working conditions, so that you're raising the quality of the jobs themselves and the positions that exist in our labor market. And I think one of the ways we thought about this was that the jobs that exist in the labor market, that's what really defines the opportunities that are available to people. And we can train people all we want, but if we are facing a labor market with a lot of low wage jobs, with a lot of positions that are on the lower end of the wage spectrum or job quality spectrum, that job training and skilling can only go so far. It can only, there's only so much that we can do through skilling alone without addressing the underlying structural problems of the expansion of low wage work and the proliferation of poor jobs. And so I'll show some data just sort of as that informed our thinking on this. One, this is probably really commonly known to most people now that are interested in these topics. This is looking at trends in wages over the last 40 years. And we've seen, of course, high wage growth for people at the high end of the wage spectrum. It's almost a stagnation of wages in the middle of the distribution. And over a long period of that time, through the 80s, decline in wages for lowest earners and that's recovered over the last 40 years, but there's very minimal growth after that, just in the last couple of years. So this is the sort of pattern that we have for wage inequality, and this is what we're looking at in the labor market. This comes from a study, an MIT study that's looking at where have jobs been growing over the last 40 years. And what we've seen is, and this is arranged, they arrange jobs by their skill percentile, which I can get into sort of technical definitions a little bit, but it's essentially along the x-axis is the skill level of the jobs. And then it's looking at where how jobs have changed over time. And what we've seen is this U-shape is showing there's been this growth of jobs at the low end of the spectrum or the distribution, and a growth of jobs at the high end, but this disappearance of jobs in the middle. Those have actually been in decline. So this is sometimes called job polarization, where we have job growth among low skill jobs and high skill jobs, but the disappearance of jobs in the middle of the distribution. And what's key, and this is key to thinking about this, how we think about skills and job training as an approach to improving the outcomes for workers, because we can see where the theory around relying on job training and skills and upskilling workers is to move workers along this x-axis farther up into the skill level of a job. But if they're starting at the low end, where we know jobs are increasing, we're trying to move them into jobs that are essentially disappearing. Those jobs don't exist in the way that they did before. And this shows the limitation of that an exclusive reliance on job training or skilling as a strategy for improving the outcomes for low-wage workers. And as I mentioned, the jobs that exist in the economy, that's what defines opportunities that are available to workers. So this is really a chart showing how those opportunities changed over time. We see a lot of growth in positions at the low end and the high end, but a disappearance in the middle. So there's the opportunities that are available for people who with these sort of middle skill levels have been in decline, and it maybe suggests that we should be thinking about improving job quality itself and shifting this whole curve up so that we're improving the position. So just as another way of thinking about that approach around upgrading jobs is, you can imagine somebody that works as a domestic worker that's generally a low paid job. And if we skill them up or train them up to get a better paying job, if it works, the best case scenario, that individual goes into a job that pays a higher wage, but that job that they left still exists. That low paying job, usually with no benefits or low benefits, still exists. So that position still exists that somebody else is going to fill. And so we still have this problem with a low paid domestic worker that's not getting benefits or paid time off, or health insurance or things like that. And that's characterizing our labor market. And so we haven't addressed, just by skilling and training alone, we haven't addressed the fundamental problems around the structural composition of our labor market. This is sort of sheds light on a similar idea. The way that wages and productivity both increased for a long time after the World War II, in the post-war era, but over the last now 50 years or so, that pattern has been decoupled. So worker productivity has continued to increase, but as we've seen, median wages have stagnated over that period. So workers are increasingly productive over the last 50 years or so, but that hasn't been reflected in their wages or in their actual compensation for the jobs, which suggests that we may not be dealing with the problem of skills and training and productivity of workers, but there's something else going on in the labor market that's affecting job quality and the wage levels of workers. This comes from a study that Gallup did recently. This is before the pandemic, which they actually recently re-updated and re-released. They did another wave of this study and released it just last week. But this comes from the previous version before the pandemic, looking at job quality and good jobs. And so I can go a little bit into how they define this, but it was really asking, there was a survey of workers themselves, and it asked workers what are the characteristics of a good job from their perspective, and they created an index that weighted those different factors. And then they asked those workers whether those characteristics applied to the jobs that they currently held. And they created this index of what a good job is. And it's a measure of good jobs, mediocre jobs, and poor jobs or bad jobs, and got a measure of what a really quantitative measure of what the labor market looks like. And we saw the trends in California are very similar to the trends overall in the US. Less than half of all workers are in good jobs. Another 40% or so are what they call middle or mediocre jobs. And that obviously tracks by income. So the lowest paid workers are least likely to be in good jobs. And a third of them are in jobs that are considered poor jobs by their own standards. And this is pretty striking. especially from California, because as I mentioned, California has enjoyed unbelievable economic growth, right? At this point of the survey, it was in a period of record economic expansion, 120 straight months of continuous job growth. And it was really the apex of what you could possibly expect from our economic system in terms of economic growth and development. And this is what that picture looks like. Even at the peak of development, an economy that most other states would be envious of in California, what it looks like is that most of the people working in that state don't have good jobs. And that showed us and sort of convinced us that we have a problem with job quality. And how we think about the future work really needs to emphasize these questions around job quality and address that problem. This was what I mentioned, the responses from the workers about the characteristics that they consider to be part of a good job. They generally rate all these very highly, but what I think stands out, what's interesting, even though they're very close, the measures, level of pay is several positions down in this index, right? There's a number of different characteristics that they rate higher than even their wages or the level of pay. Things like job security, the stability and predictability of pay and scheduling. And there's other factors like employee benefits. This is really useful when people ask, what do we mean by job quality, right? So it's obviously wages and income, but it's also regular scheduling, predictable hours. 81% of workers said that having the power to change things in their job or having a sense of control at the workplace was really important to them as well. So it's not just wages, even though wages are obviously very important. We were interested, again, focusing on the low wage section of the labor market. One of these just simple questions that we started out with is, who makes less than $15 an hour in California? $15 is a pretty low cutoff. That's obviously now, the question around the minimum wage and whether that's going to, the proposals to increase it to $15. So that's sort of politically relevant or salient threshold to use. And we were surprised to find that nearly 1/3 of all workers in California make less than $15 an hour. If you're making $15 an hour working full-time year-round, that's about $30,000 a year to live in one of the most expensive states with some of the highest cost of living areas. Women are more likely to be making less than $15 an hour, and then we see clear racial disparities where Black and Latino workers are much more likely to be making less than $15 an hour. And then we also see what I mentioned earlier, these geographic disparities. So there's a few, in Fresno, for example, we have about half of all Latinos who work in Fresno make less than $15 an hour. And so we dug a little bit deeper into this workforce that makes less than $15 an hour. And somebody asked us early on about the educational attainment of these workers. I thought it was just, it's obvious, right? People who make less than $15 an hour are going to have less levels of education, or the lower levels of education than the overall workforce, which we found to be true. So I didn't think that was necessarily going to reveal anything interesting to us, but we were all really surprised by this part, that it is true that people that make less than $50 an hour have lower levels of educational attainment than the overall workforce. That said, a good percentage of the people below that threshold actually have college degrees. So 7% have associate's degrees, another 14%, 1 out of 7, have BA degrees or higher, and are making less than $15 an hour in California, which was stunning to us. And again, pointing to this problem that, skills and training, which is often the go-to response for improving conditions for low-wage workers here, is not going to be the adequate solution, because what more could somebody do beyond, they've gotten the college degree, they've taken all the steps that they need to do to attain economic security that we believe to be sort of the narrative of economic mobility, and they're still making less than $15 an hour. So this is sort of our background in thinking about the questions around skills and job quality. Related to this also, of course, these projections that many states put out about where we're going to see job growth. And when we look at percentage change in jobs, we see things like solar installation, photovoltaic battery installation, things like that, where it's starting from a very small base of maybe 10,000 jobs and it's growing to 30,000 jobs. So it looks like those jobs are tripling in size, and that's where all the growth is. But it's actually instructive to look at it by the absolute size and number of the jobs. And so this is one of the projections that the state puts out. And these are the jobs that they're going to have the most by absolute number of job openings over the next 10 years in California. And you can see from this list that it's dominated by low-paying jobs. Things like personal care aides, cashiers, food prep and servers and waiters, retail jobs, janitors, cleaners, again, restaurant cooks. This is almost all farm workers. This is almost the totality of this list of the top 10 jobs that we're going to see the most growth in over the next 10 years or so. And I think this question around job quality and skills, we often hold up manufacturing as the gold standard of what a good job is. And I think this is also instructive to look back historically at how did we get here, right? And how is it that manufacturing is now seen as the gold standard of a good job? In the early days, manufacturing jobs were considered terrible jobs, right? They were low pay, they had long hours, unsafe working conditions, and they became good jobs over time. And there's, through government action, the government stepped in and implemented policies to improve job quality. And of course, workers took collective action to unionize, to organize, to enact new rules and policies to improve the quality of those jobs. And I think what one of the key takeaways for us for the commission here was that there's nothing inherent about manufacturing necessarily. There's nothing inherent about making things and making durable products that would make that a good job. We've seen it exist as a bad job, and we've seen it function as a very good job. But the policies and the policy context and the rules that govern our economy and the jobs, that's what influences whether a job is considered a good job or not. And so the parallels or the application to the lessons that we wanted to take away from that is that looking at the economy today, and we look at the chart that was in the previous slide, there's nothing inherent about those low-wage service jobs, care work, domestic work. There's nothing inherent about that work that means it has to be a low-wage job. And we believe through policy and through other innovative approaches, we can make those jobs into good jobs, just like we've done before. We did that with manufacturing jobs in the 30s on, and we need to be able to thinking about doing that for the jobs that are going to be growing in the future. So jobs like care work, domestic work, low-wage service jobs. And the last part of our framework that I'll touch on really briefly is this question on the fishing of work, and this is related to the gig economy. The gig economy was another theme that has dominated the conversation around the future of work, and this question of how many people are going to be gig workers, whether all work is going to be transformed into gig work, whether everyone's going to find themselves as a gig worker. And we wanted to put this in a longer historical context. There's been a long-running fishing of work that's been going on for decades. Things like outsourcing, temporary work, temp work, contracting that have essentially weakened the traditional employer-worker relationship and have created intermediaries between the traditional employer and the worker. And that's been going on for at least 4 decades. We see this trend in the literature and the data that this predates the gig economy and gig platforms. And by intermediating that work relationship between the employer and the employee, those arrangements, the research has shown those arrangements are a key driver of declining job quality. And this underlying shift towards a fishered workplace is David Weil is the scholar and policymaker who sort of coined that phrase. That's continued, and I think today when we think about gig work, it's essentially the interaction of this long-running pattern of the fishing of work with today's technological development. So the development of job platforms and things like that we've seen over the last 10 years taking place in the context of a long-running trend around the fishing of work and the breakdown of the traditional employee-employee relationship. And that's what we get that's what we get with Uber and Lyft and job platforms like that. But if we were just solving for the problem of the gig economy, or the question of the gig economy, not necessarily the problem, but if we were just solving for the nature of gig work, we would be missing this long-run historical pattern of the fishing of work. And I think there's also evidence that workers are working in gig jobs to supplement wages from other jobs, right? So they're not just working in gig work as their primary jobs, but we can see in the way that gig work is now starting to function like what we expect the social safety net to be doing. And this is another concern that we had, that gig work is not, the function of that in our economic society or system should not be to be a safety net, that we have social programs in place. We have a welfare state in place that's meant to be our social safety net. And if Uber and Lyft have come to replace our safety net, then that's a question that we need to be looking at really carefully in terms of the future of work. So getting more into the ground, the legwork of the commission itself, as I mentioned, we brought together, it's a range of stakeholders on the commission itself was made up of commissioners from labor, tech, employers in the state, the higher education, venture capitalists, and then of course some legislators and policymakers co-chaired by Mary Kay Henry, the president of SEIU, and James Manika from the McKinsey Global Institute. And they together, we, as part of this, laying out this new social compact around work, which I hopefully have sort of described what we saw as underlying problems that we wanted to solve. And the commission came together to put together this call for a new social compact as a way of addressing some of those problems comprehensively. We broke them out into a few different areas. The first is challenges around inequality, economic mobility, low-wage work. These are, I think, pretty straightforward. Things around regional inequality within California, job quality. The second, this is related to thinking about inequality and work in California. This is unemployment rates by race in California, and what we see, these fluctuate over time with the business cycle, of course. But the structure of this is by race, so it's Black, Latino, white, and Asian Americans. The unemployment rates over time, and we see this persistence or durability in the structure of racial inequality and employment in California. And this is true nationally. This is true in every state. Sometimes even in the best of times, the unemployment rate for Black workers is almost comparable to the unemployment rate for white workers in the worst of times. And those times get, those times we recognize as crisis moments when we have white unemployment that approaches 7 or 8%, but it's not uncommon for that to be the standard state of affairs for Black workers. And actually the current administration and the Department of Labor is now trying to emphasize these discrepancies a lot more and thinking about what we want for the overall health of the economy. What should we be measuring an overall unemployment rate? Or should we be looking at it disaggregated by race and really thinking about what it means to have a strong economy? If we sort of stop, or if we're happy with an economy with 4 or 5% unemployment overall, that also means we're happy with an economy that has about 8% unemployment for Black workers, right? And it never goes below that point. The second set of challenges that they identified was what they ended up calling work adjacent issues, a little term of art. I could talk a little bit about that. Things like housing costs, which I'll show the next slide, and things related to transportation, childcare, and also the broader social safety net that's meant to create economic security for workers. This is data around housing. This is in California. This is for the U.S. and California, and so this is actually inspired by the New York Times a couple of years ago. Did this look at how wages, the change in wages or growth of wages and housing costs over time across the whole country. And it showed that housing costs had gone up by 38% since the recovery in 2012, and wages had grown at a much smaller rate than that. And we were in California, so everyone, this is the thing in California that people always think that California must be different somehow. So no matter what data we would present about national trends, all the commissioners would ask, well, what about California? What does it look like in California? There's this sort of California exceptionalism, or the sense that California is somehow different from other states or the rest of the country. Generally, with economic patterns in the labor market, we find things to be pretty consistent with the rest of the country. Things like housing, we find it to be much worse in California. So here, the discrepancy is just astounding, that housing prices just over that 6 or 7 year period increased by 68%. Compared to a 14% increase in wages. So this is the reality that's facing most workers. I mentioned earlier that about one out of 3 workers make less than $15 an hour. And then you can put on top of that a huge percentage of workers that maybe make more than $15 an hour, but certainly don't make enough to pay for the cost of housing in the cities that they live in or in the regions that they live in the state. So this concern, this concern with economic inequality or economic inequity is absolutely central to our work in the Future Work Commission, and we thought needs to be lifted in the future work conversation nationally. That we needed to be thinking about how what is it that how has work and jobs failed to meet the needs of so many workers in our present context, and what does a different future look like? What is the future of work where jobs and work actually does meet the needs, or actually do meet the needs of workers in the state? This next set of challenges around that the commission was interested in was looking at new opportunities with the future work, things like workers in transition to industries and jobs that are being developed, building skills, which is an important part. It just shouldn't be the only. What I was saying earlier is that it shouldn't be the only emphasis. it's one part of a comprehensive approach to addressing the problems of work and jobs. There's a lot of questions around data, especially data in the workplace, and we know that there's extensive amounts of data that are being collected on, say, warehouse workers that are doing a lot of manual work, but it's also true in a lot of white collar workspaces as well, that there's an enormous amount of data that's being collected on workers. And there's going to be a lot of questions on how that data collection is being regulated and used by employers, and what's the role of employees in having access to the data and how that's used. There's questions around the use of algorithms, both in hiring. We've seen a lot of evidence of bias in hiring through the use of algorithms, but also in managing workers in their jobs. So for example, that warehouse worker at Amazon, they're essentially being managed by algorithms that have measured how many items they can collect and put into packages throughout the warehouse, and how they move around within the warehouse to sort of maximize their productivity. And they're being managed directly by these algorithms rather than human managers. And then, part of this is also, this is the last part, is this sort of California exceptionalism that I mentioned, this idea that California is really well positioned to be a beacon of a strong, not just a strong overall economy, but a place where workers thrive in that model of economic development. The fourth comes out of COVID. We took a few months of a hiatus when COVID really, when we were interrupted by the pandemic in the spring and the summer, and then regrouped and came back together as a commission and looked at what we learned from COVID and what it could tell us about the future work. And this is a group of challenges that the commissioners looked at around COVID, things like workplace protections, looking at how external shocks could disrupt the workforce and disrupt jobs, even when our previous context, like I mentioned, was one of extraordinary job growth and low unemployment, and then we were hit by this huge crisis of unemployment and joblessness. And so part of the social compact that the commissioners laid out first, before I get into the recommendation areas, they wanted to lay out these core principles or values that would cut across all the recommendations. So these are things like promoting equity of people and place, addressing this problem of regional inequity in California, looking at worker power that should cut across all the recommendations. So that didn't necessarily need to be its own recommendation, that we should increase, say, union or worker organization and worker power, but that whatever policies we pursued would put emphasis on things, like this. And they wanted to be very ambitious in their goals. It's a rare exercise for states to be able to sort of step back and look into the future and think about what they want from the economy, what they want from their key institutions. And so they wanted to really take advantage of that moment to be ambitious and set out what they called Moonshot Goals as part of the social compact. So this is, again, those 5 key areas of the 5 priority recommendations that I highlighted at the beginning where they landed. And I'll briefly go into just some highlights under each of these and then stop, and hopefully we can move into discussion from there. This first one around ensuring jobs for everyone who wants to work. This came directly after the COVID crisis. This was nowhere on the map. This is nowhere, we didn't have any sense of this before COVID. Like I mentioned, we had very low unemployment rates. We didn't, at the beginning of the commission, this wasn't the problem that California was facing. It wasn't the problem that people who wanted to work couldn't find jobs. But what we saw after the COVID pandemic was that, obviously we had this crisis of joblessness and unemployment. So part of this is calling on the federal government to enact a job guarantee. And this goes obviously back to some of the New Deal era programs or the New Deal era framework of government policy and its role in shaping the economy that we want to see that benefits all. And then the second part of this is thinking really creatively about California has been really active on the climate goals. The governor called for all, I think by 2035 that all new cars that would be sold would be electric powered. And so we wanted to think there's clearly political interest and energy around the climate goals in the state. So we wanted to make sure that those that also put emphasis on jobs and job quality. Thinking about that, one of the commissioners was actually Jennifer Granholm, who at the time was a professor, former governor of Michigan, then was at UC Berkeley in the policy school while she was on the commission, and now has been appointed to be the U.S. Secretary of Energy in the Biden administration, and she's carried a lot of this forward as well. You hear them talking all the time about their climate agenda as one of jobs and creating good jobs for American workers. The second priority area was as eliminating working poverty, right? This is, you know, that essentially nobody who works full time should be earning poverty level wages, should be eligible for social safety net programs. Those programs are absolutely crucial and they play an important role, but the intent, they're not meant to sort of subsidize low wage jobs. They're there to create economic security in times of uncertainty and for, you know, in times of need. And we created, you know, there's some recommendations around focusing on specific sectors like hospitality, food, restaurants, retail, and the care sector, and trying to develop initiatives with different stakeholders to increase wages that are especially based on these regional indicators, given the wide range of cost of living across the state. And then, of course, creating supports for workers to organize. There's research showing that whether somebody's in a union is actually a stronger predictor of whether they're in a low-wage job, is more protective from being in a low-wage job than even having a college degree. And so having, you know, we've seen this, again, dramatic drop. I didn't show slides or charts about the decline in unionization, but that's a clear pattern that's characterized our labor market over the last 40 or 50 years as well, and has tipped that balance in the labor market. The third one really quickly is around the worker benefits model and safety net, to sort of update it for the new forms of work and the new work arrangements. One specific initiative was to think about developing the portable benefit system, a portable benefits platform, starting with domestic workers who are generally, you know, long been excluded from a lot of our standard workplace protections. But the structure of the industry is such that you have people with multiple employers that are moving between employers and don't necessarily have one employer for their full-time 40-hour work week. And their employers are essentially families, right, that don't have benefits programs set up as part of their conditions of employment. So there's the National Domestic Workers Alliance has done some really fascinating work on this. They've developed their own platform called ALIA that employers of domestic workers essentially could contribute to a pool based on how many hours they employ a domestic worker, and that pool could be used to provide paid time off for the workers and eventually extend it to other benefits as well. That's just one of the initiatives around that topic and that priority recommendation area. The fourth is really emphasizing job quality, and it's to create a new index to actually measure job quality. They say you get what you measure, right? That's the focus of policy, right? And that's, you know, that concept through management as well. And right now we're measuring overall employment, the number of people in jobs, so we aren't officially measuring the quality of those jobs. And so by establishing a new job quality index as one of the measures of economic health of the state, we can hopefully manage that and start to and promote those goals to improve job quality. And there's ideas to create a job quality incubator to think about, you know, interesting programs or policies that could be used to improve job quality. There's interesting ideas around investment funds where they attach capital to job standards so that employers and companies have access to capital to invest in their businesses, but as a condition of accessing that capital, they agree that they'll meet certain wage standards, they'll meet certain benefit standards, retirement, things like that as well. And the fifth is sort of this general category called the commissioners called future proof in California, to really anticipate broad shocks like technological change, climate change, and things like that. And to think about where we're going to see jobs grow in the future, what are the opportunities to really focus on good jobs, high quality jobs in the future, and prepare workers to access those jobs, and to think about how we're driving investments in R&D so that they promote public good and worker well-being. And that's, again, I think a very important approach in California where so many of these technological developments are occurring. And so right now we have a lot of innovation on job platforms where it's almost set up like it's a race to the bottom, where people are innovating about how they can separate, you know, the employer from the worker, and so that people working on job platforms don't have access to improving their work conditions or their wages. And that's where we've seen innovation in employment in that regard. So we're looking to you know, a future of innovation, technological innovation that really promotes overall worker well-being. And so that's the overall big picture of this, of what they're calling for the new social compact that that implicates a whole range of stakeholders, and we can talk more about that as well. But I'll stop there, and hopefully that gives you a lot of background of of our thinking and the overall framework that we brought to the Future Work Commission, and some idea of the recommendations and a path forward.
Wow, amazing. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say thank you. That was truly incredible and impressive. And I know that our community is going to have a lot of questions and a lot of thoughts. We've got a few questions coming in, but I'm going to invite Dr. Robert Asaadi to go first in terms of just being our wonderful faculty respondent to your remarks. Dr. Asaadi, over to you.
Great, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Dr. Chaddha, for your presentation. I'm so glad that we're having this important conversation. So I'll go quickly. I basically want to respond following 3 lines of inquiry. So feel free to leave behind what is not useful and pick up anywhere you like. So the first point, back to comparative analysis, which you addressed. The study is focused mostly on work and workers in California. You included some US aggregate data as well. And in some areas you said California looks like the US economically. In some areas like discrepancy in housing costs, California seems distinctive. But I wanted to push a little further on this question of generalizability versus room, in your view, for local level improvisation. The recommendations are sufficiently broad that I think most people would say, yeah, that makes sense, imagining a new future of work. But yeah, I'm wondering, maybe is there a 6th category that didn't apply in California that you could imagine would function in a more typical American state? And yeah, it makes sense from a policy point of view that the level of aggregation would be at the state or federal level, but is there something perhaps that we're missing in terms of local idiosyncrasies of economic systems? So that's the first point. Just as a comparativist, I have to ask about that, the research design. Second part, listening to your talk, I found myself thinking about John Rawls' Theory of Justice, 1971. Some of you may know his work. Rawls, in kind of the classic tradition of political theory, is imagining what is the just society? How do we get there, right? And he basically reasons that we should start by thinking from an original position. He says, imagine that you're behind the veil of ignorance, right? This is a famous thought experiment. You don't know anything about the antecedent conditions into which you were born. You don't know anything about your political identity, your class, for example, and then imagine what type of society you want to live in. And I wonder, when we think about the future of work, the economy, the labor market, or the future of higher ed, maybe to make it about higher ed, what if we don't know? Are we a student, faculty, administrator? What type of higher ed system would we want to have? Would we want one that's cost prohibitive, that has limited curriculum, that has a contraction of full-time employment, and so on? So I wanted to just throw out this idea of Rawls and thinking from the original position. The third point, final point, many of you probably saw op-ed from Monday from the Washington Post. It was co-authored by Cornel West and Jeremy Tate about the elimination of the classics department at Howard University. So this made me go back and think again, for me, what is like at the core of so much of this futures thinking, and that is the concept of value. What has value in our curriculum? What has value in higher ed? And in this climate of the move for, quote, educational prioritization, right? Is education now solely about skill acquisition? And I want to connect that to the work that you're doing on future of work. And if you can indulge me just for a second, I'll read a quote from that op-ed, which I highly recommend. The authors say, quote, Howard University is not removing its classics department in isolation. This is the result of a massive failure across the nation in, quote, schooling, which is now nothing more than the acquisition of skills, the acquisition of labels, and the acquisition of jargon. Schooling is not education. Education draws out the uniqueness of people to be all that they can be in the light of their irreducible singularity. It is the maturation and cultivation of spiritually intact and morally equipped human beings. So I want to reorient, if I can, our discussion about higher ed this is not just about skill acquisition. And I think, you know, at least for me, higher ed can be much more than that. So I'd be interested to hear everyone's thoughts on that. Thanks.
Should I respond to these questions, or should we hear from Rhianna as well?
Go ahead, Dr. Chaddha, and then we'll jump over to Rhianna.
Okay, great. So I'll try to be really brief on this. I think those are fantastic questions. I love that. I feel like I'm back in a grad school seminar and have sort of intellectual engagement being piqued, which is very different than some of this work with dealing with the different stakeholders and the different competing interests of going 21 commissioners and sort of the politics of all of that. So this is a great way to engage with this stuff. I think, yeah, I think there's, on the first question around comparative analysis, I think I do think there's ways that California, what's happening in California does reflect on other states and other throughout the country as well. I think that these broader, especially early on in the presentation, those sort of broad-based trends around inequality, around the decline of job quality, around growing wage inequality, the polarization of jobs. I think that's a story that we see very consistently across other states as well. I think what we found, like, what was exciting to us about starting or doing this commission project in California was that I think there are some opportunities that California may have that may be a little bit unique. And I think that's, you know, we see, as I mentioned, California is ground zero for a lot of these technological transformations that are reshaping our economy and are reshaping our society. And so the actors in many cases are based in California. And if any state has the capacity to regulate or to institute new policies that shape their actions and the implications of what they're doing, it's California. And in some ways, California has, so in that regard, it's, so California has both its responsibility to people in California, of course, but because the work coming out of California, these technological changes are coming out of California and reshaping society writ large, California policymakers have this, from my perspective, have an added responsibility to people out, you know, to all workers in the economy, right? People in Amazon warehouses in Alabama, for example, their work conditions are being shaped by algorithms that are being developed in California, right, and being implemented here. And so the policymakers in California have a unique opportunity to really shape the trajectory of future work in a way that I think is unusual, and it's exciting, but places a large responsibility or burden on them. I think you had related to this was a question on local level experimentation and thinking about that. I think that's the key to it. That came up a lot in the commission. And one of the things that we did was the commission met every month, and they met in person before COVID, and we had the convenings of different cities around the state. So started in Sacramento and then did one in Silicon Valley. We were in LA, we were in San Diego, but we also did one in Stockton, California, which has gotten a lot of attention over the last few years because Stockton is a city that's has experimented with the idea of a guaranteed income program. And they've just finished this research based on a 2-year pilot of a guaranteed income program, and sort of a local level universal basic income model. And it showed that people who received this $500 a month guaranteed income were actually more likely to be in employment, to have jobs or to find new jobs than the control group, right? Because just having $500 extra a month provided a certain level of economic security where people could look for new jobs, right? Where they could look to leave a low-paid job and to move into, you know, a different position. They could afford some childcare maybe for going on job interviews and pursuing other jobs and pursuing economic mobility. So rather than sort of replacing work, this guaranteed income actually improved their employment outcomes. So I think there's local level experimentation is absolutely key. It's one of the key ways I think that we can start to get at some of the questions around regional inequality, which is huge in California, but I think also a problem in other states as well. And so that's the first part. The second thing on Rawls and the veil of ignorance and what we want from our idea of a just society, I think that was one of the underpinnings for our framework in some ways that shape our framework is, again, it's less, a lot of the future work efforts up to this point had really thought about what is it that we're going to be doing for jobs in the future. right? Like, what do we want, or not what we want, sorry, what jobs are going to exist in the future? What are we going to have to do for jobs and work in the future? What, what's going to be replaced by robots and machines? What are the new jobs that are going to be created, and how do we adapt to that future? We wanted to take a very different tack, which was, rather than thinking about what are we going to be doing for jobs in the future, what is it that jobs and work are going to be doing for us, right? What sort of social goals are jobs going to be, are jobs meant to perform that they're not currently doing in our society today? And again, when we have a state that's extraordinarily economically successful, when we look at all these sort of macro or aggregate measures, but isn't providing the sort of economic benefits to equally or even in any sort of shared way, really, across the population, that gets at the questions of what kind of economy do we want? Do we want an overall an economy that looks really successful in the macro level or an aggregate level, but fails to provide for the basic needs of such a huge swath of its residents? Or do we want a different kind of economy going forward? And so regardless of your position in that economy, whether you're a low wage worker, whether you're or a low skilled worker or an executive, that you should have access to certain your basic needs being met, and dignity in your work and other things as well that workers themselves identified as key characteristics of job quality. And then the last bit around skills acquisition in our education, whether education is primarily about skills acquisition. That's actually, I'm really excited to hear more discussion around that from the attendees and folks in this conversation. I think that I generally agree with the op-ed that Cornel West and others and his co-author put out. I think that there is a way that higher education has become very instrumental as a sort of economic input in creating workers. I think there's, it would be interesting to think about whether that's a new thing, right? Like, is that something that's novel, or has that always been, I think there's a functionalist approach to understanding, education systems that, we, for many decades from its origins, right? That some scholars would say that was always the function of education. And this isn't a prescriptive or normative statement to say that that's how it should be, but that, our education system has always been tied up in producing workers for the economy, right? Discipline, creating a sense of discipline and how you operate in a workplace that over the next 40 years after your work environment. So I think, this rollback of humanities and classics is troubling, and maybe moves us away from our stated ideals around what an education system can function as. But I also think that we would be missing something by thinking that this is new, right? That it's a novel thing. That I think, the education system has functioned to produce workers for a long time. It's functioned to produce and reproduce systems of inequality for a very long time in society. And so I think, so anything we look at today, I think we may be in sort of peak mode right now, right? With the rollback of humanities and programs like that, and this really narrow focus on preparing people as workers. But I think we also sort of need to interrogate the overall, the long-term functioning and of the social institution as a whole.
Thank you so much. Rhianna.
Hi, thank you. Those were some pretty impressive questions. So I'm a little nervous with mine, but probably the most striking statistic that you put up there, at least for me, was the third of Californians making less than $15 an hour, and a fifth of those workers having a college degree. That is just, it's incredibly upsetting. But the more that I think about it, the more I know that it's true. That's true. Oh, sorry. This is Gracie. That is, with a number of people, come on, get out here. A number of people in my life, that is their reality. They've graduated with some degree from PSU, and now they're working in a restaurant or were working in a restaurant. So I'd be interested in hearing if you had a list of what those jobs that those people had at one time, and just kind of laying out like what the demographic of that is. And then you also mentioned ensuring that there is enough work for everybody who wants to work. And then also citing that MIT study earlier about nobody knows, there's an uncertainty of how many jobs are going to be lost in automation. So how does that 1 million new jobs created in energy take into account of that study, or that kind of a study? And then the last thing I wanted to know, because if I'm taking a student perspective, this is all well and good. But as a person who's graduating and starting a job, how can, what have you noticed from this study that can be applied today that can be really helpful for those in the future? Thanks, Gracie.
That's a great question. Hi, Gracie.
These are great. These are great questions. So on the first part, I think on the people who make less than $15 an hour, absolutely. I think if this is sort of if I was approaching it solely as sort of an academic project, that would be the area of future research or further research that I was the most excited about or the most interested in. I think that that warrants attention. Who are the people with college degrees that make less than $15 an hour? Right. I think we can answer that quantitatively, right? I can pull the data and look at the occupations that they're in. We can even use longitudinal data from the PSID to look at what their trajectories have been. Are they just starting out? Is it a short spell of work just right after they finish a college degree, or right after they finish a college degree before they embark on a different career, or is it a more persistent work experience? So there's quantitative ways to answer that question. I think that it's a question that's really ripe for ethnographic research. I would love to see an ethnographic study of folks who we've seen the stuff sort of, there's a lot of ethnographic research on low-wage workers. And I think this is sort of an unanswered question. What about the people who sort of took all the steps that our society has laid out as the formula for upward mobility and have still found themselves at the low end of the labor market? Who are they? How do they get there? But I also think, how do they make sense of it, right? How do they make sense of our narratives around mobility in this country, right? When they themselves went through the institution to get the college degree and to do everything for economic advancement, but find themselves without earning, essentially poverty level wages in many respects. What does that shape how they think about mobility in this country? And structural causes? It's often very difficult for individuals to see the sort of structural factors that govern their lives. So it would be really interesting to see if folks who have gone through those institutions have a different view on structural explanations of inequality or lack of mobility. So I think that's I think that's fascinating. If there's any students or grad students in the audience, so that's something that I think is really worth looking at. And then from student perspective, I mean, this is what's interesting. So I think the question on skills and training is an interesting one, because it's, to be careful again, it's not the case that the greater training skills or education is useless, right? It's not. So it is true that people with generally people with degrees or higher levels of educational attainment are better off than if they had lower levels of education, or you're right. And then if that same person had lower levels of education. So there is a positive effect on income, on wages, and also a whole other range of social outcomes as well, from having higher levels of education. So you are generally better off having higher levels of education than not. But looking across border or sort of bigger picture, it's not doing what the college degree is not doing, either what it once did or what we're expecting it to do. So I think, it is a really tough question from what does a student do with this? And I think, as I said, they're better off with greater levels of education than less. Although there's really interesting research came out of the Federal Reserve Bank in St. Louis that showed the differences of an impact on a college degree, the differences across racial groups, right? That college degrees have a really strong effect, positive impact or positive boost on wealth for whites graduating from college or for white families, but that effect for Black and Latino families has almost disappeared in terms of wealth. So in terms of income, people are doing better, but because wealth takes into account your debt, so rising student loan debt and things like that, the rising costs of financing that debt and the cost of getting that education in the first place could be zeroing out what used to be potential wealth gains from college degrees. And so it's disparities across racial groups and also change across birth cohorts, so that basically older generations got a huge boost from the college degrees in terms of their income and wealth, but that over time has been diminishing. And so I worry about, I don't mean to be painting such a bleak picture. I think there's what I would say is people, whether it's for instrumental purposes, sure, they should be looking to do as well as they can, but it's also important to look at the to be part of shaping the policies and the policy context that come to shape our society and our economy. So that was our approach with looking at, these technological changes are not inevitable. The effects of the changes are not inevitable or predetermined, that we have agency in shaping how those play out. So, people graduating today, it should be not just an instrumental education and getting the skills and training for a job. It should also be seen as this sort of civic engagement with becoming a leader who's going to be shaping that context for of policies. What kind of society do you want to create? What sort of society, and especially what kind of economy do you want to have? What role can you play in that beyond using your degree to just get a job?
Can I ask a quick follow-up question? A good friend of mine recently decided to go to a coding school over the pandemic because she was a restaurant worker. She had a college degree working in a restaurant and kind of had nothing going on. Did you explore that at all within, as part of like a future of education within California, and how that would impact the future of work?
Yeah, so there's very mixed evidence on the sort of the effects of, especially around coding schools. I think there's success stories that come out of that, but I think in terms of systematic evidence, and it varies. It depends so much on where people are coming from, what their origin position is, where they're starting at, and what the job market that they go out into. So it'll be interesting to see. I don't know if where this friend's at now, because coming out in the economy, say of 2014 or 2015, is very different than coming out of the economy of post or the COVID economy, right?
It's incredible. She just got a job and is paying double what she was being paid before in a restaurant. It's like a surprise. Yeah.
Yes, that's a success story. That's great.
Yeah.
I'm really struck with, thank you, Rhianna. I'm really struck by the powerful nature of just really involving economic policy in a state to really be investing and shaping a landscape of more equitable jobs. And I guess I would ask you, what do you think the role of a future-facing university is in helping to shape economic policy that reinforces more good jobs?
No, that's a huge question, and I'm not enough of an expert, I think, on the higher education system to comment that thoughtfully on that. I mean, I think that it's tough, because I think that I presented a lot of this stuff, similar work to a consortium of community colleges in California, and I think I was a little bit apprehensive about, especially the data on skills and training showing sort of how the limitations of that approach, because that's essentially what the community colleges are doing, right? That's essentially what their focus is on, improving skills and training workers. And the instrumental purposes are even more explicit for community colleges. And I was very apprehensive about, having that discussion, because it's sort of like, this is the work that you're doing, and this is really an incomplete approach, and it's maybe fundamentally flawed and inadequate. But the response from them was actually the opposite. It was almost like they were relieved to see that, it's not on them, right? That it's an unfair deal, right? To be looking at education institutions, to be solving these problems through skills acquisition, right? That we have structural problems in our labor market. We've seen the proliferation of low-wage jobs in the last 40 or 50 years. These are the jobs that exist in the economy. So that 14%, that percentage of people that even get their college degrees, if the jobs that are available to them are low-wage jobs, that are server jobs, that are working as waiters or waitresses, so people fill those positions. That determines the opportunities that are available to workers. So I think, it's an unfair situation that educational institutions are in, or that they're being put in to sort of be the primary response to economic mobility or upward mobility, when we have failed, essentially, from a policy perspective, from a policy standpoint, to create better opportunities. You can't create different jobs through training, right? You can't really create better jobs by upskilling workers. We have to upgrade the jobs themselves. And I think that's generally outside the domain of higher education. I mean, I think I saw this in the chat, which I think is an important point. There's another way to look at it, which is that, higher education, they are institutions themselves, economic institutions, right? And they do employ people as well. They have economic impacts on their communities, but they are employers. And I think that the trends that we've seen around sort of adjunct work and the changing arrangements of flexibility in academia are sort of parallel what we've seen in different aspects of the economy as well.
Thank you. Jean Cheng asks, a recent McKinsey report noted that not only are middle wage jobs disappearing, but they're shifting from one industry to another. So retraining, upskilling low wage workers is more complicated. How does upgrading jobs lift the curve given these other dynamics? What approaches have you seen that are promising?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, let me read this. They're shifting from one industry to another. So retraining, upskilling, which is more complicated. Yeah, and I think, so by through policy interventions that are meant to sort of raise the floor, right? They are cross-cutting across the economy or across the labor market, right? So the very simple example is minimum wage, and that's by no means the only example, but that's, I mean, I think shows it the most cleanly, that by increasing the minimum wage, you're raising the floor for all workers, right? So that it doesn't become about a competition between employers around who could, pay the workers the least and lead to the sort of race to the bottom of the deterioration of job quality. And there are other measures as well that I think are interventions around raising the floor across all industries and across all jobs, so that it's not, you don't get caught in this sort of competition of declining work standards.
Thank you. A couple more questions. These are great, everybody. Thank you for contributing. We have some guests from partners in Vietnam. Hello, partners in Vietnam. We find that the Vietnamese are highly dependent on the future of work research and foresight from the WEF, the World Economic Forum. How does the new Compact California work align with or differ from their approach?
I think the fundamental things are, I think we have a very strong explicit emphasis on economic equity that is quite different from a lot of the other, what has been done in the, sort of, if it's a field, the future work field up to this point. I think there's been very heavy emphasis on technological change and automation and sort of predicting the jobs of the future, and relying explicitly and almost exclusively on skills and training as the way to adapt to society for the jobs of the future. And I think we try to look beyond just that aspect of matching workers to jobs and really thinking about what are the broader set of social institutions that we need to have in place that are more likely to lead to more, more the sort of vision of more expansive vision of economic equity that we want for our state.
Thank you. That was Marcus Engel, by the way. I'm trying to say these names. Rachel Cunliffe asks, how has our appreciation of essential workers during COVID changed? Or how might it change if we don't go, quote unquote, back to normal, but use the pandemic as a reset? Just your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. I think there's, we saw a lot of expressions, I think, of the appreciation for the value of essential workers, who are, in many ways, it maps on with our data of low wage work, right? Of service sector workers, of the essential workers, the frontline workers, people in care positions, in restaurants, in retail, and things like that. And so we've seen even a lot of healthcare jobs that have quite low wages. So we saw this sort of, this collective expression of enthusiasm and appreciation for workers, people banging the pots and the pans and everything at one point in the pandemic. And I think the key now is to translate that into actual policy change, right? That those sort of symbolic expressions of appreciation they don't go too far in terms of somebody's pocketbook, right? That we need to, hopefully there's a way that policymakers can capture that energy and that attention to these problems and shape a new, shape a future or shape a vision that has improved work conditions for frontline workers, for essential workers. That, it's often said, right, that a crisis is also that a crisis necessarily also creates opportunities, right, and creates opportunities for change, and it creates a rupture or disruption in the way that the current functionings of the system. And so I think that's one way that I personally hopefully see that we see more activity and movement there.
Thank you. We're not gonna have time for all the questions. I'm gonna try to wrap a few together here. A couple people have asked about who's responsible then for enacting these recommendations, and can you speak more about how these recommendations are being received by policymakers? Mm-hmm. This person goes on, this is Jay Alford, says it's interesting to think of California as a foreground for issues that have national impacts. Makes me think of recent legislative battles with Prop 22 as a response to AB 5. Further thoughts on just making legislative progress
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the idea of the social compact, right, was that it necessarily implicates a range of stakeholders, right? So this isn't just recommendations for state legislation, right? This isn't just a report to the governor or recommendations to the governor about what he should be doing, but that we're thinking about these different social sectors, right? The employers, workers, and the state, and others as well. As mentioned, the education system. I think California has a special role for tech companies and VCs as well. So I think the idea of the social compact was that all these stakeholders played an important role, and they play different roles, different parts of it, but that it can't just be put on the desk of state legislators. That there's only so much that they can influence or control. That said, we had a few state legislators on the commission as commissioners, so they're looking to move some of these the pieces that can be the most concrete in legislation in this next legislative session. But we were also very careful. The state secretary of labor, who's now going to be to be confirmed as the deputy secretary of labor for the country, Julie Hsu, was very clear that the sort of time horizon for the commission should be 10 years or longer. That we should be looking to solve problems that are farther out than what the legislative calendar would be looking at in the next legislative session. So some of the recommendations are a little bit broader or are more general, and they're not ready. They're not easily captured in a legislative bill that could be introduced this session to be implemented. But I do think that I think this question also mentioned the unique position of California. I think that we've seen this. We sort of were inspired by a lot of the stuff that the positions that California has taken in regard to climate and environmental issues. And so I think we thought, why can't we play a similar role in issues around work and economic equity as well?
Yeah, I think that broad approach is really inspiring. It is really inspiring. One person asked, Lillian Bedoin asked, do you think workers and industries continuing to utilize remote work post-pandemic might contribute to more fishing and by extension further exacerbate the prevalence of gig work, bad jobs? That's an important question, I think.
Yeah, that's an incredibly important question. That's a great question. I think what we've seen is that this is a new axis of inequality, right? That the people who've been able to access remote work and people who had to work in person, right? That it maps on being almost perfectly with wage levels and income levels. And the experience of work in the pandemic it's just two completely different worlds, right? So we have one world of people that are doing remote work, are able to work from home, like me, sitting here in my living room. And for long periods of time, with the economy shut down, people were essentially saving money, not spending money on normal economic activity, right? So you had the sort of wealth accumulation that's now showing up in housing markets in big cities across the country, right? Where you have people who sort of sat on this wealth that they've created over the last year, or driving up housing prices in competitive markets. But we see this, completely different experience with workers who generally are lower paid, frontline workers, especially in the service sector. And I think that, remote work, can it continue the fishing work? I think that's what I expect to happen. I think the nature of that will be interesting to see. I think there are to see how some of these are hard. Some of these evolving arrangements are hard to predict, and so we can, will we see things like, I don't think it'll look like Uber or Lyft for white collar workers, right? I don't think that's the shape that those changes are going to take. But I think that the greater acceptance of remote work, the maybe shift towards a couple of days in the office and a couple of days at home, or even though we work as a company, may have had their own economic troubles in terms of their overall well-being. I think those models of these third spaces for work could change. Like what is it that employers are providing? What's the model? What's the compact between workers and employers when you're either expected to be doing so much work from home, so you're providing a lot of the reproductive work for your own during your workday. Yeah. Right, which wasn't the case before. So I think the ways that this is going to reshape work is fascinating. And unfortunately, it took us by surprise, and we weren't ready. We weren't able to really address a lot of those questions in the commission itself. But I think now, if another state were to do an effort like this, I think it would be really fascinating to start to look at some of the implications of those changes.
I've seen a lot of, and we've been having a lot of conversations just on the future of commercial real estate and the number of, workplaces that are just giving up their brick and mortar workspaces because they're going to start having people work at home. So we've got a really big question here at the end. Can you please unpack how it is possible to reprioritize the value of work? What does that look like on the ground? From Aaron Fernandez-Mamer. The big question.
Yeah, that's a huge question. I mean, I think that what I would say is I would take that question and focus more on the strategies around how you do that. And I think what we've seen is not that it could all be reduced to this, but I think one of the most important strategies or responses has to be greater worker voice, right? Or greater worker power. We've seen it's just the sharp decline in worker and unionization rates, the decline in union density over the last 40, 50 years that maps on exactly with this period of rising wage inequality and income inequality, the sort of devaluing of work. And I think the more we could see workers have power in the workplace to shape the working conditions, to have a voice on the job, and to shape policies that govern the realities of work. I think that's how, that's what I think is instructive about the historical example of manufacturing jobs, that they started out as really, really bad jobs. Yeah. And we made them into the gold standard of great jobs. Yeah. And we didn't do that it wasn't because those workers were suddenly more skilled, right? It was because in large part, they organized and they had a greater voice through unions and through collective action to put political pressure on policymakers to change policies that would then shape how our economy functions and our understandings of what people deserve as part of work and what value that they get as workers. So you have people who in many cases didn't need college level education to work in manufacturing jobs, right? But those jobs came to come with dignity, right? And they became jobs that provided a decent standard of living for families and for people that were working to support themselves. So I think having stronger voice and stronger political power for workers generally throughout our economy is going to be key to that.
I apologize to everybody. We got a few questions we just did not have time to get to. I want to thank you, Dr. Chaddha, so much. I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Asaadi and Rhianna Mungin. Thank all of you again for being here. We have 3 more webinars in this series. Our next conversation is going to be a very deep conversation just about what is work. Our 3rd session is going to be with a variety of state officials in both higher ed. Our state economist is going to be part of that webinar, and efforts throughout our state to sort of begin to develop our own little interpretation, well, not little, our own significant contribution to, I think, thinking about what are state policies that might be relevant in this space. So, and then our last session will be a sort of PSU response about what we are thinking about. And Dr. Chaddha, though I appreciate, I really appreciate you saying, that isn't the job of higher ed to tackle this per se. I think there's places we can be leaning in together and being part of organizing and social movements that do contribute to the fight for more equitable workforce ecology. And I hope that we will take that opportunity. And certainly by elevating the conversation the way you have with us today, we're in a much better position to do that. So thank you again to everyone who joined us, and please do visit the PSU Futures Collaboratory. You can find out more about Dr. Chaddha's work at the Institute for the Future website and the California Commission of Future of Work website. Thank you to everyone and have a great day.
Great, thank you.
Let's continue the conversation.
Thank you.